Have you ever been unfairly judged because of how you look? In today's story, a simple walk in the park turns into a life-changing moment for a young kid who faces an injustice that many of us can relate to: racism. What happens next is something you won't expect. Imagine walking down a quiet path, minding your own business, when suddenly someone accuses you of something you didn't do. You're just trying to enjoy your day, but now you're caught in a whirlwind of accusations and fear. That's exactly what happens to this kid when a random call to the police sets off a chain of events that could have gone terribly wrong. What do you do when you're unfairly targeted? And how do you fight back when you feel powerless? Stick around, because the twist at the end will shock you, and it's a powerful lesson for us all. Don't skip this, because this is a story you need to hear. Before we dive deeper into this gripping story, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, Epic Story Moments, yet, now is the perfect time. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update, and be the first to hear our incredible new stories. Don't forget to like, share, and comment to support more heartwarming tales like this. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. A peaceful afternoon unfolded in the suburban neighborhood, where the air was warm, and the sounds of children playing echoed through the streets. Amidst this tranquil setting, a black boy, around 14 years old, walked through the local park, his backpack hanging loosely over one shoulder. He wasn't doing anything unusual, just enjoying a rare moment of freedom after school. His face was a mixture of calm and curiosity as he strolled past the trees, his mind likely on the upcoming weekend, perhaps thinking about a game with friends or the homework he had to finish later. The park was filled with people, mostly families and couples, enjoying their day. There were parents with strollers, joggers, and people lounging on benches. But there was one person among the crowd who stood out. Not because of the clothes they wore or the way they carried themselves, but because of the look on their face. A woman, seemingly in her 40s, was sitting on a bench with a perfect view of the boy. Her gaze followed him closely, and as he passed, her eyes narrowed. She seemed uneasy, her posture stiffening as she watched the boy. There was something about the way she scrutinized him, her eyes flicking back and forth between him and his surroundings. To her, something felt off, but it wasn't the boy's actions. It was his presence, his skin color. The woman, who we will call Karen, shifted uncomfortably, her face contorted slightly, as if she were trying to place him into a category that fit her preconceived notions. She had seen so many stories on the news about crime, and in her mind, she associated certain things with danger, regardless of the truth. The way the boy walked, the bag he carried, even the slight frown on his face as he passed her, all made her feel uneasy. He seemed like a threat, even though all he was doing was walking through the park. He wasn't bothering anyone. He wasn't even looking at her. Yet Karen's mind was already at work, shaping an entire narrative about him. A narrative that wasn't based on his actions, but on the color of his skin. In that moment, she made a decision. She pulled out her phone. Her fingers trembled as she dialed a number. The calm, rhythmic hum of the phone ringing was drowned out by the rush of adrenaline that surged through her veins. She was about to make a call that would change everything, a call that would set events into motion that no one could have anticipated. As the phone connected, Karen's voice, though soft, had a tone of urgency. "Hello? Yes, I need to report something. There's a young black male walking around the park. He's acting suspicious, and I think he might be up to something. You should send someone to check it out." The dispatcher, on the other end of the line, paused for a moment, processing the words. "Can you explain what's happening? Why do you think he's suspicious?" Karen didn't hesitate. "I don't know exactly. I just have a bad feeling. There's something about him that doesn't sit right. You should send someone to take a look." The dispatcher, sensing the vague nature of the call, attempted to ask further questions. "Ma'am, can you describe what he's doing that's suspicious?" Karen's frustration mounted. "I don't know. I just feel like he's up to no good. Can you just send someone, please?" As the dispatcher confirmed the details, Karen hung up. A sense of relief washed over her. The action had been taken. She had made her call, and now the police would arrive and she would be vindicated. Or so she thought. Meanwhile, the boy continued on his way, unaware of the looming danger. He was focused on his steps, the faint sound of birds chirping in the background, the occasional laughter from children playing nearby. His mind wasn't on anything troubling. He had no reason to be suspicious or fearful. But all that would change in an instant. As he walked further, he noticed a shift in the atmosphere. People seemed to be staring at him, not in a curious way, but in a way that made him feel like an outsider. A cold chill ran through him, a sense of unease settling in his chest. He didn't know why, but something felt off. His hands clenched around his backpack straps as his eyes darted around, trying to figure out what had changed. Then he heard it, the distant sound of sirens. His heart skipped a beat. He had been in this neighborhood his whole life, and nothing had ever happened like this before. Was someone in trouble? Was there an emergency? He turned around slowly, his eyes searching the streets for any sign of danger. And then he saw them, the police, their cars slowly approaching. His stomach dropped. His breath became shallow. Was it a coincidence? He tried to calm himself, telling himself that the officers weren't here for him. But deep down, a part of him knew. The sirens got louder, and soon, the squad car pulled up. 2 officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the area. One of them locked eyes with the boy, their gaze cold and distant. Without a word, they began walking toward him. The boy's initial confusion deepened as he walked through the park, his steps slowing down as he noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't anything loud or obvious, just a growing feeling of discomfort. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but as he passed by a family on a bench, he caught their eyes. Their gaze quickly shifted away, and they turned their focus back to their children. A quick glance, a slight turn of the head, but the look was unmistakable. It wasn't just him. People were starting to notice him, and not in a welcoming way. He kept walking, trying to ignore it, trying to push the feeling down. It was just a park, after all. He had walked through here countless times, with no one ever making him feel out of place. But today felt different. He noticed a couple of joggers who had been running a few steps behind him now quickened their pace, pulling ahead in silence. A mother grabbed her child's hand and pulled them closer. They weren't running or moving too quickly. They were just moving away. The boy's heart began to race, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic mess. What was going on? Had he done something wrong? The last few days had been normal. He had woken up early, gone to school, laughed with his friends, and now, here he was, walking through a park he had visited so many times before. What had changed? What was wrong with him today? His palms began to sweat as he tightened his grip on his backpack, the straps digging into his shoulder. He walked faster, hoping that whatever it was, it would go away. But the looks from the people around him didn't stop. And then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of police sirens. The boy froze. His blood ran cold. The sirens grew louder, echoing in the distance. His hands trembled as they gripped the straps of his bag even tighter, and his feet, once steady, now felt heavy. His mind began to race, trying to connect the dots. He hadn't seen any emergency, hadn't heard any commotion, yet here they were, the police, coming toward him. His stomach twisted in knots. He tried to calm himself, to breathe deeply, but the tightness in his chest only increased with each passing second. His eyes scanned the park, hoping to find some form of reassurance, but all he saw were people who were no longer looking at him. It felt like the world around him was turning into something foreign, something he didn't recognize. His heart pounded in his chest as his thoughts turned to past stories of people like him, people who looked like him, who had faced violence or worse at the hands of the police. The fear he had tried to push away earlier now gripped him, his mind replaying stories of racial profiling, of people who were innocent but treated as threats because of the color of their skin. Was this happening to me now? He wondered, his pulse quickening. He had heard the stories, seen the videos, read the headlines. He knew all too well what could happen when people assumed the worst about someone based on their race. He glanced around, desperate for some kind of answer. But the only thing he saw were the police cars pulling into the park. 2 officers stepped out, their uniforms crisp, their eyes scanning the area. One officer's gaze locked onto him almost immediately. He felt like they were looking straight through him, and he couldn't escape the feeling that something terrible was about to unfold. He couldn't breathe. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like a physical force, suffocating him. He swallowed hard, trying to make sense of it all. His mind raced. Was there something he could say to make them see? To make them understand that he didn't deserve this? He wasn't a threat. He wasn't doing anything wrong. But the words felt stuck in his throat. What if they didn't listen? What if they didn't care? The officers approached, their eyes still fixed on him. The boy's legs felt heavy, like they might buckle beneath him. His stomach churned and his throat felt dry, as if he couldn't get enough air. He didn't know what to do. Should he speak up? Should he try to explain himself? He thought about the times he had heard of people being questioned, detained, or even harmed for less. He thought about his father's warnings, the conversations he had overheard between his parents, about how to stay calm when the police were around, how to avoid making any sudden movements. But none of it felt real, not until now. Now! With the officers moving toward him, every piece of advice his parents had given him was a blur, lost in the rush of fear and confusion. "Hey, kid!" One of the officers called out, his voice loud, cutting through the tension in the air. The boy's heart skipped. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady himself, but everything felt like it was moving too fast. He could feel the stares of the other park-goers on him, feel the weight of Karen's call on his shoulders. He was just a kid, just a regular kid, walking in the park. But now, he felt like he was under a spotlight, a target. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly, trying to stay calm, trying to make sense of this madness. The officer glanced at the other, his expression unreadable. "What's going on here?" the second officer asked, his tone more questioning than accusatory. The boy's hands were still shaking, but he held his ground. He didn't know what was happening, but he wasn't going to back down. He tried again. "I'm just walking. I didn't do anything." The officers exchanged a look, but they didn't respond immediately. The boy's mind was reeling. He wanted to shout, to tell them that he was innocent, that he hadn't done anything to deserve this. But the fear held him back. He was just trying to survive this moment. Then, as if the universe was trying to give him a break, he heard a voice from the crowd. A bystander had spoken up. "Why are you questioning him? He hasn't done anything," the woman said, her voice firm. The boy turned to see who it was. Several other people had stopped, watching the scene unfold. More voices began to join in, speaking out against the injustice that was clearly happening. The boy's breath hitched. For the first time in what felt like forever, a spark of hope flickered inside him. Maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The sirens grew louder as the police car pulled up to the park, their flashing lights cutting through the stillness of the afternoon. The boy's chest tightened, and his eyes darted nervously from the officers to the growing crowd of onlookers. His heart hammered in his chest, and his palms were slick with sweat. The officers stepped out of their squad car, their eyes scanning the park before locking onto him. The world around him seemed to slow down in that moment. The heavy weight of the situation pressed on him from all sides. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, every stare, every judgment. The officer who had made eye contact with him earlier took a few steps forward, his hand resting on the radio attached to his uniform, while the other officer hung back, surveying the scene. The boy's stomach dropped. What was happening? Was this really happening to him? He had done nothing wrong. He hadn't even noticed anything unusual, just an ordinary day, walking through the park. Yet, here he was, facing two officers who seemed to be waiting for him to say something, to make a move that could change everything. The first officer finally spoke, his voice loud and stern. "Hey, kid, what's going on here?" His eyes didn't soften as they stared at the boy. The boy felt his throat tighten, but he forced himself to stand tall. He had been in enough situations to know that showing fear could make things worse. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He looked the officer in the eye, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm just walking," the boy said, his voice wavering slightly. "I haven't done anything wrong. I don't know why you're here." The officer didn't respond immediately, instead glancing over at Karen, who was still sitting on the bench, watching the interaction with a look of self-satisfaction. Her eyes gleamed as though she knew something the boy didn't. The officer turned back to the boy. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated, feeling the weight of the question. Was he really being questioned like this? For walking in a public park? "It's Jordan," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jordan, huh?" The officer's tone was cold, as if he didn't believe him. His eyes flicked back to Karen, waiting for her to offer some sort of confirmation, some kind of validation for her call. Karen stood up from the bench now, her posture stiff and proud. She had made the call. She had been the one to alert the police. And now, she seemed to feel entitled to the situation. "I saw him walking around, and he looked suspicious," Karen said, her voice sharp. "He had a backpack, and he was acting strange. He didn't look like he belonged here." The boy blinked, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what was happening. What exactly was Karen accusing him of? Acting strange? Walking around the park? He could feel the frustration welling up inside him, but he swallowed it down. He couldn't afford to make this worse. "He's just walking, lady." One of the bystanders called out from behind. The voice came from a man in his 30s, standing a few feet away with a group of others. His face was tight with anger, his arms crossed as he looked directly at Karen. "You can't just call the cops on someone because of how they look. This is ridiculous." Jordan's heart skipped. Someone had spoken up for him. He wasn't alone. Other voices started to join in. A woman in her 40s with a stroller, who had been walking by earlier, stepped forward. "I saw everything," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "He was just walking, minding his business. There's no reason for the cops to be here. This is nothing but racial profiling." Jordan's chest tightened with a strange mix of gratitude and disbelief. It was as if the weight he had been carrying all this time had suddenly lifted, just a little. He wasn't sure how things would turn out, but the fact that people were speaking up made him feel less alone. A few more people added their voices to the chorus. A teenage girl standing nearby pulled out her phone, pointing it toward the scene. "I'm recording this. People need to see this." Karen's face twisted, a mixture of anger and defensiveness. She wasn't used to being challenged. "I'm just saying what I saw. He's up to something. You're all just making excuses for him." But no one was backing down. The boy stood there, still, trying to hold it together, while the bystanders continued to push back. The crowd had formed a loose circle around the officers and Karen, and the tension was palpable. The officers seemed hesitant now, unsure of how to proceed with the situation. One of them glanced at the video recording on the teenager's phone, then back at Karen. The officer spoke again, his voice carrying a little more authority now. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to explain exactly what you saw." Karen's mouth opened and closed, her words struggling to form. I saw him walking around suspiciously. He didn't belong here." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Is that all you have? A feeling?" He looked at the boy, then at the bystanders who had spoken up. "This doesn't seem like a situation that requires police intervention." The other officer stepped forward, his hand moving from the radio to his holster as if to reassure the crowd. "We're going to need to wrap this up," he said, glancing at the growing number of people around them. "This isn't the kind of call we should be responding to. We'll be leaving now." Jordan stood there in stunned silence as the officers, realizing they had no grounds for action, turned to leave. The crowd began to disperse. murmurs of approval and support floating through the air. He wasn't sure if he should feel relieved or angry. The weight of the moment still hung heavy on his chest, but at least he wasn't alone. The community had stepped in when it mattered most. As the officers walked away, Jordan's eyes found Karen one last time. She stood there, her face flushed with frustration, her eyes blazing. But she had no power here. She had made a false accusation, and now the truth had come to light. The boy turned to face the small group of people who had spoken out for him. A woman smiled at him warmly, offering him a reassuring nod. "Don't let people like that get to you," she said kindly. "You've got a lot of people who have your back." As the police officers stood there, silent for a moment, the weight of the situation began to sink in. The tension in the air was thick, and the eyes of everyone in the park were fixed on Karen. She had been so certain in her accusations, so sure that her call to the authorities would bring some kind of justification. But now it was clear there was nothing to back up her claims. The first officer glanced at his partner, a silent exchange passing between them before he turned back to Karen, his tone no longer carrying any trace of doubt. "Ma'am, after speaking to the witnesses and assessing the situation, there's no indication that any crime has been committed here. Your accusations were unfounded." Karen's face went pale, and her mouth opened as if she were about to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes darted nervously around at the people who had stepped in to defend the boy, their gaze unyielding, their voices still echoing in the air. She could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. I didn't mean anything by it," Karen stammered, her earlier confidence evaporating. She shifted uncomfortably, glancing from the police officers to the crowd. "I just saw him walking, and I don't know. I thought he looked out of place. I was just concerned." The officer who had been speaking to the boy raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Concerned," he repeated. "You thought a kid walking in a park looked suspicious, so you called the cops? Do you realize how dangerous that assumption is? How many people have been hurt because of situations like this?" Karen flinched at the officer's words, but she didn't back down completely. "I'm just saying he didn't belong here. I was worried something might happen." The officer sighed deeply, frustration clear in his voice. "You've caused a scene over nothing. There's no reason for this to have escalated like it did." He paused, looking at the boy, then at the bystanders. "You've made an innocent child feel unsafe because of your assumptions, and that's not okay." The boy, standing in the center of the scene, felt a strange calm wash over him as he watched Karen squirm. For the first time, he felt like he had control of the situation, like he wasn't just a victim of someone else's bias. He took a deep breath and straightened his back, his voice growing strong as he spoke up. "This kind of thing happens all the time," he said, his words cutting through the air with surprising clarity. "People see me or people who look like me and automatically think we're a threat. But we're not. We're just trying to live our lives. I didn't do anything wrong. I was just walking in the park. I'm not your problem." His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. The crowd, which had been murmuring in the background, now grew quiet, their attention fully on the boy. The officer, who had been listening carefully, looked at the boy with a new respect. He nodded slowly. "You're right," the officer said, his voice softer now. "No one should have to experience this. I'm sorry this happened to you. You're safe here." The boy felt a surge of gratitude at the officer's words, though it wasn't enough to erase the sting of the moment. He wasn't sure if the apology meant much, but it was a step in the right direction. The officer turned back to Karen, who was still fuming, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to admit her mistake. "I'm giving you a warning, ma'am," the officer said, his tone sharp. "This behavior is unacceptable. You can't go around making baseless accusations and expecting people to take them seriously without consequences." Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. She stood there, blinking, her face flushed with embarrassment. The officer's words were a final blow to her sense of entitlement, and she realized for the first time that her actions had consequences. The police had been called to deal with a situation that never should have happened in the first place, and now, instead of being in control, she was the one on the receiving end of a stern warning. The officer added, "You need to leave this park now." The crowd, sensing that the matter was finally resolved, began to disperse. The boy watched as Karen hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously between the police officers and the people who had defended him. With one last huff, she turned and walked away, her face a mixture of frustration and defeat. The boy stood still for a moment, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. The park, once filled with tension, seemed to breathe again. The sounds of children playing, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, all returned to normal, as if the entire ordeal had been a strange, fleeting nightmare. One of the bystanders, a middle-aged man with a warm smile, approached the boy. "You did good, kid," he said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You handled that like a pro." The boy managed a small smile, still trying to absorb everything that had just happened. "You're not alone," the man added. "There are people out there who see the truth, who will stand up for you. Never forget that." The boy nodded slowly, feeling the weight of those words. He had faced something difficult, something unfair, but in the end, he had come out stronger. The community had rallied behind him, and together, they had made sure that justice was served. In a small but meaningful way, he had learned that speaking up, standing tall in the face of injustice, was the first step toward real change. As he walked away from the park, his head held a little higher. The boy knew that this moment would stay with him forever. He had been empowered not only by the support of others, but by his own strength to stand up for what was right. As the tension from the earlier confrontation began to dissipate, the park seemed to return to its usual calm, but there was something different in the air now, something hopeful. The boy, still processing everything that had just happened, looked around at the people who had spoken up for him. His heart swelled with gratitude as several bystanders, who had stood up against the injustice, made their way over to him. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes approached first, offering him a soft smile. "Hey, I just wanted to say you handled that really well. I'm proud of you," she said. The boy's eyes widened, his throat tightening as he realized the weight of her words. "Don't let people like that get to you," she continued. "You've got a lot of people on your side." Before he could respond, another man, a tall figure in his 40s, came up beside them, a reassuring presence. "I saw what happened," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. If you ever need someone to walk with you, just let me know. I'll make sure you're safe." The boy felt a lump form in his throat, the kindness of the strangers around him starting to wash away the lingering sting of the incident. It wasn't just the fact that they had stood up for him in the moment. It was a realization that there were people who would continue to support him beyond this day. The community was not just a group of strangers. They were allies, ready to stand together and fight for what was right. "Thank you," the boy said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I didn't think anyone would help me, but you did. Thank you so much." The woman placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone, and we'll keep standing up for what's right together." Her words, simple yet powerful, brought a sense of peace he hadn't felt since the moment Karen first made her call. The group began to disperse, but the energy in the air had shifted. It was as if the park itself had become a symbol of unity, where individuals came together to protect one another from injustice. The boy, feeling more empowered than he had before, turned to leave, his heart a little lighter and his steps a little steadier. As he walked, he looked back once more at the people who had shown him kindness. They were still talking, still standing together, reminding him that the fight for justice didn't end with a single moment. It continued with every act of solidarity. Every time someone spoke up against racism, every time someone chose to challenge prejudice and ignorance. The camera panned out, capturing the boy walking away, his head held high, as the voices of the bystanders faded in the background. The final message appeared on the screen, bold and clear. Racism thrives in silence, but unity and awareness are the first steps towards change. The boy's calm response to Karen and the strength he had found in the support of the community left a lingering sense of justice and hope. In that brief, powerful moment, the boy had not only defended his dignity, but had helped shift the narrative, one that would resonate far beyond the park. The video closed with a final thought. It's crucial that we challenge prejudice wherever we see it. Together, we can build a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, no matter their race. The message lingered as the screen faded to black, leaving the viewers with a sense of empowerment and a call to action, to stand up, to speak out, and to never let injustice go unchecked. If you believe in standing up against injustice and want to see more stories that inspire change, don't forget to like this video and share it with your friends. Together, we can amplify the message that racism has no place in our world. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a powerful story that challenges prejudice and spreads awareness. Your support helps us create more content that empowers and unites. Let's keep the conversation going. Comment below and let us know how you stand against discrimination. We are stronger together. This call to action is designed to not only encourage engagement, but also to reinforce the message of unity and collective action against racism. Would you like to make any changes to this? Or is it good to go?